We're in the affective domain today. We've been educated in the cognitive domain. We read things, we write reports, we do checklists, book report. This is not that. The affective domain is about feelings, reactions, responses, emotions. That's the domain we're in today. So those wishing to provide sexuality education, we must first examine our own attitudes, values, and motives. We don't need to change them, but we do need to see where they get in the way of giving honest communication. I think that's the right one next. So 3 areas today: knowledge, attitudes, and skills. Those are the 3 areas that we need as parents, professionals, service providers to be able to work with our youth in the area of sexuality. When I work in the area of sexuality, if I'm working with one individual, I might not have ground rules or rights and responsibilities, but anytime there's 2 or more and it looks like a group, I never start the conversation without creating a space that's safe. These ground rules are for you. I'll give you an idea of the ones I use for students. So everyone is responsible for their own learning today. Make sure you get what you came for. Time is valuable. You're very busy and successful people. Make sure you get what you came for. Everyone has the right to their own values, beliefs, and opinions. Today is not the day to change another's. It's a perfect day to embrace your own. That will make a lot more sense a bit later. Everyone has the right to be listened to. Everyone has the right to pass. That doesn't mean you're going to get a grade at the end of the day. It means if there's something you're not sure you want to participate in, you can say pass. But you must either say pass or use your hand, because I will never read silence as anything but silence. Okay? I've learned that from teenagers. Nothing drives them more crazy than when they're silent and we make up all kinds of assessments about what they're thinking and how they're feeling. Silence is silence until they give me the words to say who they are and what's going on. Everyone has the right to confidentiality. What that means is you can share what you learned, like the teachings, but leave the story here. So if somebody shared about being like the best, had the most knowledge about all the different amazing flavors of condoms, when you left here, you wouldn't say, I don't mind if you use my name, but somebody else here might not like if you say, Stephanie was at this conference, and we were talking about condoms, and she brought out so many flavors. I didn't know she knows all that. I wonder what she does with them. No. That's sharing the story. What you can share is, I learned there are many different flavors of condoms. That's what you share. Okay, there's a difference there. Now I say that too because sometimes when we start to get into the teen years and we start to run into some of the inappropriate sexual behavior with youth, let's say, and even if it's in the school system, we have to stop and look at confidentiality again. Because sometimes we need to share the information as colleagues, but sometimes we share it because it's interesting. But what we've done is we're actually violating the privacy of another person. Because, you know, many of our children who are neurodiverse, their life is in books. It's written everywhere. They don't have as much privacy sometimes as they'd like to. And some of the information shouldn't be left in their school file. When I see clients in my office, that information doesn't go to the school. It's just too private, and it's too volatile to end up in the wrong hands. So that's a really important part too, is what are the policies around how information is stored depending on how private it is. Sexuality. What is sexuality? Well, it's more than just sex. It's everything about us as men and women, boys and girls. It's what we talk about, our families, our parenthood, good decision making, our knowledge, our attitudes, our values. It's so shaped by the context that we live in, our culture, our history, our education, our experiences. It's a very broad context. So when we use it today, sex is a very little part of sexuality. There's so much more. The total of who we are, the decisions we make, what we believe, our background, and how we express ourselves. And you know, when we look at how we eat, how we cry, how we dance, how we sing. My sons played football. People told me children with autism couldn't play football. Well, I'm one of those people that rolls up my sleeves and says, oh yeah? Let's see. But of course, I was like the trainer on the team. every team, right? So that I was there. And so after football, they'd come home and they're really hungry. And the way they would chow down and eat was like, oh my gosh, you're hungry. But then I said to them, so if you ever decide to go on a date after football practice, you might want to come home and eat first. Because if you're that hungry and that's how you eat on the date, I don't think there's going to be another date. Right? Because two boys, I am the female in the house, and there were times that it was appropriate for me to let them know what my experience as a female was in being with them. Because where else are they going to get that? So when I was there, like, oh, well, if we were dating, I wouldn't be coming back. Right? And so that's when I saw, man, it's even expressed in the way we eat. It's expressed in everything. I mean, if we're at a dance and all of a sudden somebody decides to get down and start dancing and doing all kinds of stuff, and it's kind of an environment, like the Queen's Ball, that's not going to be quite right. And so our sexuality is expressed in everything we do. So how did we learn about it? Where did we get our information? So what I'm going to ask you to do, and this is an interactive part, but it shouldn't be a problem with the camera, because I'm going to ask you to pick a partner. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to just look at how did peers, people around you learn about sexuality when you were growing up? From whom? Was the information correct? What would you have wished you had known? And was there anything you wish your parents had told you? What were your parents' attitudes? How did your parents relate to one another? And if you don't want to talk about any of that, then you can just talk about the last line. If you had one message to leave your children or your students about sexuality, what would it be? So please go ahead, and before you start, when I need you, I'm going to put my hands up and I'm going to wiggle my fingers. And if you see this, it means please stop talking and look back up here. That's how I work with the students. It's very visual. They know what it means, and they can be quiet, look, and we can get started. So some of the things I'm doing with you, I do with students. So ready, set, got a partner? It can be 3 of you. Go. Please finish up. Please finish up. Thank you. Great. So, interesting conversation. Based on time, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Usually we go into discussion, but I know that time's going to rob us of some of these things today. Not all discussions, though. Did anybody get the book? Anybody get the talk? Anybody get from parents? Nothing? Yeah. So if we got nothing, or the book or the talk, but before I go any further, did anybody get a really good conversation? Like you had a parent that was really brave and they spoke out? Yeah, it's about 5%, 5 to 7%. So, like, we got to be good to ourselves, right? We didn't grow up with this. We're figuring it out as we go along, and then we're passing it on. So, some of us got a book, some of us got nothing, some of us got parents. But those of us who are neurotypical, we were able to pick it up from our peers, parents, siblings, TV, movies, experimentation, sex ed in school. But our individuals with challenges, they lack exposure to their peers. Parents, sometimes we avoid the discussion. We're not sure what to say and when to say it. They may not live with family. Exposure is limited. And there's limited privacy. Sometimes there's behavior problems, and the amount of education is inadequate. Because many of our individuals, if they get it in a group situation in the classroom, they got something. But sometimes it isn't until we get one-on-one that we find out how many gaps there are in what they thought they got. Okay. So I just want to talk about the elements of sexuality for a moment. We can never relate to an individual like these are separate entities, because they're not. They're completely intertwined. I'm only separating them so that we get a sense of what they are. So sensuality is our body's ability to feel pleasure, and it's mostly that's what sensuality is. Body image, the sexual response, our body's ability to feel pleasure. Intimacy in relationships is exactly that. Intimacy in relationships, liking, loving, risk-taking. Intimacy is risky. And reciprocity, social reciprocity. Sexual health, often when we come into a high school, that's the circle that gets focused on. Can you come in and talk about contraceptives, sexually transmitted infections, like that. That's the sexual health part. And you can begin to see why sometimes we're a little hesitant to just do the sexual health part because we're not sure what's happened in the other circles. And it has to be holistic to make the biggest difference. You'll notice there's an octagon that says use of sexuality for control. And the reason it's separate is because that octagon, so that's harassment, that's sometimes media, sexual abuse, that falls into that circle, the dynamics of power. That octagon, can create dark shadows on all the other circles. And often that's the other one we focus on because we're looking at abuse prevention. So sexual health and abuse prevention, we find those important and they get the focus. They all are important. This one I'm going to talk about, it's sexual identity, because we're not that familiar with it. And for people on the spectrum or neurodiverse, we're finding that there's more flexibility in this circle. Because for some of our neurodiverse individuals, they just want to be with people that they feel good being with. They don't really care what gender they are, they don't really care what parts they have. What they're looking for is connection, similar interests, and ways to relate. So biological sex, the top one, and then there's our anatomy, what we're born with, the hormones. The next one, gender identity, is our sense of self. Third one is gender expression, how we communicate our sense of self. And the fourth one, sexual orientation, who we're attracted to. Now here's where we get caught. We assume that a male person who's born and identified as male is a man, he's going to be masculine and attracted to women. And we assume that a person identified as a female at birth is going to be a woman, feminine, and attracted to men. Well, maybe. But what we're discovering is a much bigger spectrum than that. So a person could be born male, identify as woman, express themselves masculine, and be attracted to men. Did you follow that? Okay. This becomes a really important piece of people discovering who they are and how they feel. So for people, there is a higher percentage of people who are neurodiverse, specifically on the autism spectrum, who are gender variant or gender flexible. We don't say gender dysphoria because they're not upset. They're not having any problems with it. We might be, but they are not. So it's a flexibility. If they're having problems with it, then we'll call it gender dysphoria, and yes, we'll make referrals, and yes, people will help. But they're not always experiencing a challenge with the makeup that they have. Okay? We could spend a whole day just on this too. So let's just take a minute to look at where have we come from. So when we go back to past attitudes, historically, people who were had neurodevelopmental challenges, we had two thoughts. One is, well, we better withhold the information because really, what are they going to do with it? And then the other part was, because we thought they were kind of asexual, so they didn't need it. But then the other contradiction was that, oh, but be careful because they actually might be quite promiscuous and not know what to do. And so there was all this contradiction, asexual or hypersexual. There was no normalcy around sexuality. So there was a fear that we had to control sexual needs in order to protect society by confining individuals into segregated institutions and sterilizing. That's where we came from. Now, or the present attitudes, deinstitutionalize, normalize, mainstream. This is 1972. The reason I'm pointing that out is because some of the videos I'm going to show you are from 1975, because nothing has been made since then. Okay? So in 1972, there was an increased interest in sex education for individuals with challenges for two reasons. One, emphasize the skills needed to function in the community because they had to handle their own sexuality. And two, to emphasize the aspects of functioning that are consistent with patterns and behaviors of neurotypical people. So oops, things like neurotypical person in a work environment probably won't be going like this because they're aroused. And some people will say, I'm just rubbing against a chair as if I've got an arousal moment. That's all I'm doing. I've got my, so sometimes people will say, my child doesn't masturbate in public. But if they rub their genitals, even though they're fully clothed, on a chair in a workspace, they call that masturbation in the workspace. So they had to learn to handle their bodies in such a way that none of that happens when they're in public. That was a big calling. So hence, the importance and the emphasis on sexuality. Now, I apologize for all these words, but I just wanted to explain the video we're going to watch. I'm just going to read this. So ask any adult, this is what the video trailer said, and they'll tell you about the difficulty and awkwardness of explaining the birds and the bees to a kid. Now imagine that you are trying to explain sex to a developmentally disabled individual. The word trainable is used in the video because it's 1975. Through this film, Planned Parenthood tried to make this daunting task easier by giving teachers and counselors pointers on broaching the subject. A valiant effort at the very best, but it still has awkward, unintentionally funny moments, mostly due to the teachers. What I find valuable in this video is that actually, you're just going to see clips throughout the day. It shows the teacher, the counselor, actually teaching the individuals with challenges using the visuals that need to be used. The reason I bring it up is because our children aren't in residential care anymore. They're in the home, school, community. They still need the information. When you see the skill set of the people teaching, the question that comes up is, and who's doing that now? Who's got that training now? And who's the one who's going to do what they're doing? So we all get to look at, does this fall into my role? How do I support the family? What can I do in the education environment? So this just shows the beginning of why this is so important. Now hopefully this is going to behave. So those were the concerns that we had to deal with. How do we teach to be in the community and be safe? So then we had to look at future attitudes. So that was, and what happened is we basically had to look at rights and the rights of individuals with challenges. So one of the reasons we don't have videos today is because when that video was taken, she probably didn't get, her parent probably signed that form. But today, individuals have rights, and they don't want to sign the form about filming me while I'm getting my sexuality education. Okay? So we don't see as much. So the rights that came up were the right to receive sociosexual training that will open doors to social contact within the community. Access to knowledge about sexuality that they can comprehend, including their rights and responsibilities, and making decisions about marriage and sexual behavior and parenting. The right to enjoy loving and being loved by the attracting sex, including sexual fulfillment. The right to the opportunity to appropriately express sexual feelings in the same ways that are socially acceptable by other people. To marry, the right to have a voice of whether or not they should have children, to the supportive services. So this is 1979, this is 4 years later that the rights came out. So then we had to look at what is sociosexual development. And what we discovered, of course, it has to do with social skills, sexual expression, social skills development that alleviates problematic sexual behavior, and education that would be needed throughout. So that was quite a shift. Now, why no new videos? On the heels of this, AIDS came up. There was a complete shift in education and health and what needed, and so we didn't go back to furthering the resources. And then the rules change. So now some of the resources that are photographs of human beings, we can't make those anymore if they're human beings who are nude, because now it's called pornography. So we can't, we're using resources from 1975 because we actually, based on the current laws, can't even reproduce the materials. Okay? So what is sociosexual education? Effective education that emphasizes interpersonal skills and includes growth. Why? Body awareness. Adolescence can be confusing. People's behaviors are often labeled as deviant. Are they sexual or asexual? We looked at sexual health, protection, things like that. This gentleman talks about why it's important.
Sex education.